Hello and welcome to the Level Up Lounge. I'm John and I'm here in the studio with a guest that I'm very excited to introduce you today. We have Yat Siu, who is the co-founder and chairman of Animoca Brands. So Yat, thank you very much for coming to Dubai and obviously spending some time with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Perfect. So today I wanted to talk to you about a load of different topics and we're probably going to be very pushed for time to get it all in, but I'm keen to explore today with you. I want to talk NFTs. I want to talk the open metaverse, everything that you've been pioneering at Animoca. But to start with, I wanted to understand where the initial shift came from to move from mobile gaming into more Web3 blockchain gaming. Because there was around 4 years of Animoca, which was more focused on
Actually,
mobile.
much more than that. Animoca really started in 2011.
Oh, wow.
Animoca Brands was a spin-out of Animoca itself in 2015 when we became a public company in Australia. But really, our mobile gaming roots was in 2000 and actually 2010 that became Animoca in 2011. And we were one of the biggest mobile app game developers at the time. You know, this was when Angry Birds just launched, for instance. We did a lot of hyper-casual games. But we had a big event in 2012 that changed the trajectory when Apple basically removed all of our apps. And so that sort of experience sort of taught us a little bit about sort of centralized platforms. But more importantly, sort of how dependent we suddenly became on the space for platforms like Apple and Google. But yeah, so we were in gaming for quite a while. And of course, my own background, my first job was actually with Atari back in the 80s, so a long time ago. So consequently, we've always had sort of strong gaming roots.
Yeah. And so was it that shift and the implementations from something like Apple that then thought we need to move away from this?
Well, at the time, we basically shifted to Google, and that actually helped us, from the business perspective. But we really didn't sort of go into the Web3 gaming side up until our studio in Vancouver was involved in building a little product called CryptoKitties. Yep. And this was in 2017. And when we saw that, we came to realize that this was really the first time in which someone could really own their digital property in the game that they could never do before. And now for those who would remember back in the day, for people who were playing games like, I grew up with things like Ultima Online, for instance, Bard's Tale, like all these classic type of games back in the day, and also playing multi-user dungeons like these text-based games. And I would actually buy and trade these these virtual items for real money. But, it was a very, very sort of clumsy way of doing it. And so to me, it was like, well, hold on, if I could actually own these items and I could transfer them on, and I could also use them in a way to get credit in other games, that would change the industry forever, we thought. And so we decided to go all in what was known as NFTs with ERC 721. With the advent of CryptoKitties, became their publisher, and then really started to help build that ecosystem. Because in early 2018, nobody was doing anything in NFTs, nobody was doing anything in Web3 gaming. So that's when we invested in Axie Infinity, we acquired the Sandbox, we invested in OpenSea, a whole of these companies to help build that space, very early in things like Polygon as well, called Matic back then. And, as you know, the space exploded in 21. And with that, our business trajectory sort of accelerated from that. We've, of course, sort of branched out a fair bit more beyond gaming. Today, we have over 540 portfolio companies, but 160 of them are in gaming. And we think gaming is the best way of bringing people into Web3 mass adoption, because we spend about $100 billion a year on gaming items, and we don't own them. Yeah. And the other thing, of course, is that from a studio standpoint, we spend $100 billion a year advertising our games, and none of that goes back to the gamers either. So Web3 isn't just a model of, hey, how do I actually sort of own these gaming items? It's also a model in which the studios have better forms of user acquisition. The critique that people have is around airdrops, free money, maybe, but that seems crazy. It's not free money. It's just the inverse of marketing. If I spend money on Apple and Google to advertise my game, it goes to Apple for what purpose? To acquire a user. Well, wouldn't it be better if you could actually give that money to an end user who's actually playing your game? And if he doesn't like it, he sells it, sure. But if he does like it, not only will he end up using the money he received as credit, he'll probably buy more. And that's exactly what we're seeing as well. And so I think obviously there's some early weaknesses in the model just because of the fact that people are just doing it for money only, and there's airdrop farming and so on. But there's ways around that. If you remember back in the early days of the internet, even things like advertising was subject to a lot of fraud too, like click farms. People basically sort of like in China, they would have had thousands of mobile phones that were just literally lined up, and they would just pretend they're clicking to generate advertising revenue. Same thing, right? So you have these cycles you go through, and you just get better at it. But that's what's really exciting about the space.
Yeah, and I think that that's been a big piece. And I talk to a lot of people around gaming, and that's what I think would draw me more into this space is the ownership element of it, because I spend a lot of money year on year with traditional games, and I'll be giving Activision and EA Sports a lot of money, which 12 months into that cycle will just disappear and fall off, and I start again. There's no real ownership of that, and I think that
there's no history.
That's what I mean.
Yes,
yeah, in terms of
and I think to your point, ownership is one thing.
Yeah.
But what is the benefit of ownership? It's not just a capital. It's actually your reputation. It's your social status. So when I own an item in a game, I can actually, like how people have skins, they actually look at that as a form of status. In gaming, the carrying business is not that small, right? Where people basically hire better gamers to carry them so they can earn that skin and that rank, right? That's just another form of commercial enterprise. But if I want that status, if someone was willing to sell it to me, wouldn't that be more efficient? Wouldn't that be better? Provided, of course, that the game platforms allow this, because right now it's all permissioned in the Web 2 games. Now, what I see real value in, a lot of people talk about sort of interoperability. We're big believers in that space as well. But I think the largest form of interoperability that Web3 gaming will allow for, because you own it, isn't the fact that the item can be used in one game or the other. It's nice, right? It's the fact that that status that I have makes me a target of, the potential sort of, game I might like to play. So if I'm an Apex Legend player and I reach a certain rank, then someone who's starting a new first-person shooter can basically target me by giving me an airdrop and saying, hey, you know what? I know you're that rank. You own these skins. You have these items in that game. Wouldn't you want to come try this game for free? That's a much cheaper, much more effective form of user acquisition than essentially paying Facebook and Google all sorts of billions of dollars, of which there's literally a single-digit percentage of conversion, where you're basically just literally shooting money to thin air, as opposed to giving money to the very gamers that you think will try it. And when they like it, of course, then they'll start spending money in it. And of course, that is anathema to the traditional game companies, because they're like, that's my customer, I don't want to give it up. But in Web3, you can make money from the trade and the transactions, and therefore, actually, you will make more money and grow the ecosystem because of the way that you can do this in Web3 that you couldn't do in Web2, which are these closed ecosystems. The thought experiment I often give to people is around, imagine if Fortnite skins were NFTs and they weren't locked into the Fortnite ecosystem. How many other game studios around the world would start using Fortnite skins in their game? Almost everyone.
Yeah.
For the express purpose to say, I want to target a Fortnite customer. Now, one way to think of it is, oh my goodness, I'm losing my customer to 1,000 games. But the other way to look at it is, now you've created an entire ecosystem around Fortnite and Fortnite skins, and where someone's doing Fortnite fashion night or something, or someone's running, I don't know, some Fortnite event in Roblox, or someone's basically doing, some kind of Fortnite party, or maybe someone's doing a Fortnite, I don't know, sports event or something. Actually, we think it's going to grow the Fortnite ecosystem, and that's what we see in Web3. It's going to make the ecosystem proliferate, which drives more people to go back into the main game, because that's where the assets are generated. And of course, more importantly, the players in Fortnite benefit the best, which then gives them more loyalty and ownership in the game. Right? So this is actually how token ecosystems grow. But of course, because traditional game companies make a lot of money without having to do this, they don't feel forced to do it, which is actually the opportunity. It's kind of like the same with mobile gaming. If you remember back in 2011 and 2012, when we started, it wasn't EA or Activision that brought mobile gaming. It was startups like Rovio and Supercell that basically were startups who then became the incumbents afterwards.
Yeah. So you mentioned there obviously about the larger game studios want to hold on to everything that they have. What do you think how do you think, or when do you think that may be that they will eventually adopt what you've discussed there and think, actually, that does make sense? Obviously, you're preaching from the rafters in how this can work for the larger studios, but do you think there'll be a time where they'll go, you know what, maybe we do need to adopt?
Sure. Actually, I think that moment will come very soon.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that Asian game studios are already all adopting it at the moment. When you look at Nexon or Sega, Square Enix, right? These are large gaming companies. They're all looking at a Web3 strategy. They've got a Web3 team. Versus the Western game companies, with the exception of Ubisoft, Activision and EA aren't doing that. But the reason they're not doing that isn't because the studio executives don't think there's potential. Remember, studio executives, it's about driving value, profit, and returns. If there's money to be made, they want to do it. There's a reluctance within those gaming studios because many of the game designers themselves, in the West, are not that pro-crypto. And that means it's not just about NFTs. It's just generally about the fact that, real money elements inside gaming to them feels wrong. And what I've learned over time, and what we've learned as a group, is that it has a lot to do with, frankly, where you stand ideologically.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not so much about I don't like crypto gaming or Web3 gaming or NFTs because it gives you ownership. I mean, obviously, there's nothing wrong about that. It's the fact that it becomes financified the moment you have ownership, because that means I can trade it and there could be a value. It also means that someone is participating in an ecosystem who's not a gamer in themselves, but they might want to partake in it because they see there's potential profit, which then from their perspective perverts the sort of idea of the game. But that doesn't make it open, that makes it closed. It's kind of like no different than I'm UGC content, as in I'm accepting that the users themselves will create an ecosystem of their own, versus I want to control it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the game designers have been designing their games in a manner where they want to control the outcomes, right? Which to me is a little bit like a planned economy. And what's the planned economy? It's very socialist, right?
Yeah.
So by design, I would argue that most game designers, even though they live in a capitalist society, are actually much more socialist left-leaning and therefore are much more critical towards crypto. Whereas in Asia and here in the Middle East, for instance, why does Dubai have so many Web3 gaming companies? Dubai is probably one of the most capitalist places in the world, right? And the ideology here is pro-capitalism, pro-property rights, and free markets, right? So in those places where you embrace that, it's more natural to go there. That said, the companies like EA, Activision, and those big ones are, at the end of the day, companies that are, have a duty to their shareholders to make profit. And when blockchain games make more money, which invariably they will do, and we think per capita anyway, they make more money per player, then they will be forced to go into the space, if for no other reason than to stay relevant, which I think will be the mainstream view probably in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I think that's a generational shift as well. When you look at the audience coming through now, they are very much wanting to own their data, have that sort of, and I think that shift from a mindset perspective will end up having to push the more traditional studios to adopt a different tact.
The path of the future is open, right? And we lacked a way in which data as an open framework and the ownership of the benefits of the data could translate to anything meaningful of value, because we never knew it. But we already had a version of that in Web 2, which is open source, right? And there's no such thing today anymore as closed source in the traditional sense. You have to build and develop on top of open source. I mean, in the AI world, just look at what DeepSeek just did. The biggest basically upside down move was to basically take a framework and make it open source and completely change the trajectory of where where AI is going, which I think is great for the industry. And I think in the realm of data and data ownership and the benefits of that, like in the form of NFTs, that's actually what we're going to see in the world of gaming. Gamers will expect to want to own their items. In fact, when you talk to a gamer about their skins, they probably think they own them already. Until suddenly they don't, and they realize that they don't have access to it, or they can't trade them or do stuff like that. And by the way, this also, I think, comes to a degree of financial literacy that you need to have as well. Most of the gamers don't have an appreciation for what ownership is because they take it for granted. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why the West and the East, as it were, have taken slightly different views. Because in Asia, property rights and ownership is a fairly new concept that we appreciate, because we came out of environments that had nothing. I mean, China, or take South Korea, one of the gaming centers of the world, 40 years ago had a GDP smaller than that of North Korea, right? Yeah. And what was the transformation? Property rights, capitalism. And that actually grew to what it is today. And so people in Korea, the youth in Korea, for example, I think something like 60 or plus % of people under the age of 30 all have crypto, or maybe even exclusively only own crypto assets versus sort of, let's say, shares, for instance, right? So you can see that shift and that perspective, which is very much in contrast to, for instance, like Europe.
Yeah, no, and I agree with what you were saying before about the designers of games, because obviously our main port of our business is speaking to designers and trying to bring them into new opportunities, whether that might be. And there is that huge skepticism when we mention that there's a Web3 element, or there's a... And I've even had times where we've been recruiting for a studio that there is a Web3 element that hasn't really been discussed. But the concern then be that they find out there's a Web3 element and go, whoa, what am I doing? This is not against my beliefs, or I don't want to be doing this and I don't want to be touching that. But as you mentioned, I think that with the games that have come out into the ecosystem, like your sandboxes, and giving that ability to people to create games that are free to go in whatever direction they please, is what's drawn such a large audience, and I think continues to draw that younger audience into those games.
So, in 2024, I think we closed the year with around 6.6 to 7 million daily active users playing Web3 games.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good number. I mean, of course, it's nothing compared to a Fortnite. But the combined market cap of all of these Web3 gaming sort of companies in terms of token prices is around 20 billion, 18 to $20 billion. And what's fascinating, and this is the message I have to all game designers and studios around the world, especially the smaller ones, they're all indie studios, right? Try and make a living on Apple with an indie game. Good luck, right? I mean, right now, the App Store and to some extent Steam as well, for most of the game developers and studios that are out there, have essentially become what sort of Spotify is for musicians. Marketing and distribution, but the ability to actually make money doesn't come from the platform in and of itself. They have to hire KOLs, they have to hire third-party marketing agents, you have to go outside to do it, to try to generate some revenue. And then when they make money, they got to pay 30%. But for what? The reason you pay 30% to the platform, right, on top of the advertising you spend, is because you're hoping they'll give you customers.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, who decides that? Well, if Apple features you, maybe you're in luck, right? So that means Apple has become the kingmaker of your products because they decide what's good or what's not. And we spotted that as well, where we started realizing that we weren't making games that our users necessarily wanted. We were making games that Apple wanted us to make, in a way. Because if you do the right type of product that Apple will like you for, then they'll feature you, which means more success. And it basically became a distribution game. And in Web3, distribution is just flipped upside down because of the incentive mechanisms like through airdrops. But more importantly, you don't have to share 30% of your revenue. You have an audience that you can tap into. You have mechanisms that are much more fairer and better. And as a small game studio, like, Axie Infinity, the Sky Mavis team, which is a studio that, we backed very early on. In terms of its customer size for Axie, the game, it's, hundreds of thousands of players. That would not survive in Web 2. But in Web 3, it's $1 billion ecosystem, with millions of dollars of revenue and interactive players. So again, I would say if you're an indie game studio, frankly, you're kind of stupid not to be looking at the Web3 opportunity. And it's no different than those, because I went through that cycle. In the early days when we went into mobile gaming, the people who were in trad gaming, as in like console and PC gaming, they were like, this is rubbish, this is not fun, nobody's going to do this. And now they're probably all working for mobile game companies. It's kind of the same thing. It's a new paradigm and you're not taking advantage of it. And by the way, business models too. Like, before it was paid games, then it became free to play. And the number of game studios and game companies that were just rejecting free to play out of, frankly, what seemed like ideological reasons, but frankly, actually was to the detriment of their own studio, themselves, and ultimately the very customers, as in the gamers that they serve, was all to their detriment.
Yeah, and I think that when you then pose this question to a lot of people that work in the industry, they then turn around and go, well, there's not been any good games within Web3. Or they're very skeptical of the quality of the games because they're building large, of a AA, AAA with huge budgets. And they ultimately will then just class their game versus what they've seen already within that space.
Yeah, but that's the same argument for mobile gaming, right? Yeah. I mean, one of the most successful games, whether these are sort of Farmville in first generation or, Candy Crush, Angry Birds, I mean, people were even sort of criticizing games like, Clash of Clans, just because from their perspective, they were like, this isn't like Call of Duty. Sure, it's not like Call of Duty. But just to remind people in the space, what is the number 1, number 2 game in the world? It's Roblox, and number 2 is Minecraft. Tell me about their graphics. Not exactly the best in the world. Why do people play games? At the end of the day, most people play games, as we know from Bartle's model, it's for social reasons, right? And the quality of the game experience actually brings people in, are the ones that sort of have fun and bring the social layers in, like, what they call the adventurers and the achievers, right? That's the classic model. So 20% of them are that, but 80% of them play for social reasons. And I think this is the part where some of the game developers maybe miss the point a little, where they feel like the quality, the AAA, the special effects is kind of what makes the game. And it's the same thing for Hollywood. I mean, in Hollywood, you can have great special effects, but if the plot is kind of duh, then it just won't do nearly as well as the so-called lower budget movie that has a very rich plot line, very good acting, and high quality in different ways. And in Web3, by the way, we do have some good games. I mean, I think the poster child in terms of the AAA category was obviously Godzilla's Off the Grid.
Yeah.
But, take a game like Axie Infinity, right? A lot of people were like, this game's dead, whatever. It's thriving. But it's not thriving because it's the highest quality looking game. It's thriving because the first generation of Axie players that came in, they stayed for social reasons, created a community, and now it's become essentially a community of players that then created more networks and then enhanced and built out these network effects. And we see this for indie games that are also of lower quality as well. I mean, there's a number of games that are very popular on Steam and on the App Store that, again, are not AAA, but people like to play them. So, yeah, I think the visuals and the quality of the game is, to me, just sort of it's like the red herring. It's like the way to say, hey, look at this. But then actually your own industry shows that that's actually not the case.
Yeah, because obviously you've had titles such as Concord and that they can spend millions and hundreds of millions on that will fail.
That's right.
So I think that COVID should have taught a lot of these studios and these developers, especially developers and designers that are in an industry which is quite unstable in places at the moment, and seen that it is the social element that is drawing a lot of the younger audiences in. I got really back into gaming over the COVID period, more to socialise with people that were in different countries on through that part of it. So I think that, like you mentioned, Roblox and Minecraft, the graphics-wise, the game, it's not that why people are there. They're being drawn into that through spending time and quality and socialising with people within that community. And like you say, Discord channels and everything that all goes alongside it.
That's right.
That's what should be looked at nowadays rather than how good it looks just visually.
It's about deepening the network effects, right? And the deeper you create a network effect within whatever community you're building, and this is true for token economies as well, not even just for games, then the more value you create out of the ecosystem, and frankly, the more valuable it becomes for the end user. People don't necessarily look at their sort of time spent in purely economic terms. They look at it very much in social and also in cultural and symbolic ways, right? So in other words, when I create a status inside Roblox or inside of any other game, it's not the money that matters. What matters to me is how other people see me, what respect I have, and more specifically, how other people see me in a close circle of friends and community that matter to me, right? And that's what actually gaming does really well, because gaming is one level beyond, like Discord is obviously a glue that connects you in some way in the gaming world. But actually gaming creates that additional layer. Like for instance, you're questing together or you're doing a mission that's difficult. And what the gaming also does is it creates struggles, even if they're artificial. So you overcome the struggle together. And we know that this type of adversity creates tighter bonds, right? Like in real life, in a relationship, when you go through difficult times and you survive and actually sort of get out of it, you actually become stronger for it. And in gaming, we're simulating that environment all the time, whether it's a different level, different quest, different challenge, different fight, different battle. These are all things that we're sort of pushing towards something that's difficult for us. And when we do it as a community, then it bonds that, right? And that's what gaming does exceptionally well.
No, I totally agree with you on that. I wanted to touch on the roles of NFTs in gaming, because it's a subject that, again, you mentioned this to traditional sort of game developers, and there were those 3 letters that sent all the red sirens going. But how do you feel that these can truly enhance the gaming experience?
So because of its non-fungible, as in unique sort of identified manner, we think of NFTs as the ultimate cultural and symbolic status item. Now, let me sort of give this parallel example. It's like in the physical world. You don't buy a Birkin bag because you want to put stuff in it. And you don't buy a Rolex watch to tell the time. Right? There's a lot more cheaper and effective ways of doing that. You buy it because there's a network inherent with it that shows something of your achievement, that pronounces and sort of promotes a certain type of, let's call it, reputation that you want to sort of put out. And that doesn't have to be expensive. Like, for instance, if you are wearing something that was very organic, or whether you're having certain protein shakes, or whether you have a GoPro camera, everything we wear in physical life and do, we're actually saying something about ourselves. Are you here in a suit and tie, or are you here in sports gear? What kind of image are you trying to portray? That's actually what we do as humans all the time. And that's actually what gaming does with these type of items and skins and so on. So to me, that's actually what NFTs represent. They mostly represent cultural and social social capital, and also symbolic capital. But because of the fact that you can sell them, and because money started to get involved, and because, and this is the superpower of Web3, you have very frictionless transaction elements. You can create volume out of things that might have not normally been possible. And we see this in gaming items, like for instance, Pokemon. Right? When Pokemon first came out, nobody thought that the trading business of Pokemon cards would be as big as it is. So why did it become valuable? Well, it became valuable because there's a community of players who actually coveted it and thought this was something that was important to them. More importantly, though, they received kudos within the Pokemon community to say, hey, you have this card. That's really cool. How did you get that? And that's actually the reason why it became valuable. It didn't become valuable because it was, the rarity was an element of the story and the narrative, but it was really sort of because other people in the community, which comes on to the other point, it has essentially created elements that are meme-like in nature. And of course, in crypto, we have sort of, people are very negative on meme coins. But really what a meme is essentially something mimetic in nature where we agree on a cultural artifact of something and then we share in that value and then give it power, as it were. And that's actually what happened. These sort of cultural gaming items have become memes of their own, have become sort of cultural status items, and then they become coveted. And NFTs is just a better way of sort of representing that. Also a way in which you can then sort of show that status for another game. So like the Fortnite example that I gave, if I wanted to attract a certain person in Fortnite, I could make utility for that item. He could become potentially my customer. I can't do that today. There's no way of having that kind of data portability or reputation portability that you can in Web3. But the other thing we love a lot as well about NFTs is that you build a community around the ownership of the items. It's not so much about the value. Now I know who owns these items. Let's say, and we've seen this for many cases, if Ultima Online had all of their items as NFTs back in the day, and as we know, Ultima Online shut down, do you think someone else would have started a clone or relaunched Ultima Online and just say, hey, everyone who, I can see how many customers there are and I can reach out to them because I have an NFT? I think games wouldn't shut down the way that they are. If it's a successful game, people would build sequels after sequels or create versions of it and address them because there's a community to go after, right? And so there's both the economic side and of course the business side as well. Yeah,
and I think something you were saying about the Pokemon just reminds me, just collectibles in general has always been there. Mm-hmm. If you bought a toy as a child and then you go into your loft to see if it's still in the packet, because all of a sudden if it's in the packet, it's worth X amount of money. It's just moving that real life into technology. And I think that people need to understand the reasoning for some of this, more so than the skepticism of it.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, of course, value is generated from, the time you spend on it as well, right? And why it's sometimes so difficult for people to comprehend is because they look at physical items and say, okay, a Picasso is worth this much. Really? Why, right? Or, a physical Pokemon card might seem worth a certain amount because you're engaged with it. But where do we spend most of our time? Online, right? I think the highest countries in terms of engagement, places like Turkey or like Asian countries, I think spend somewhere between 8 to 10 hours a day online, right? So wouldn't it therefore make sense that the more time you spend online, therefore the more status items and symbolic items online are more valuable? Do we covet us being on the cover of some kind of random newspaper around the world? Or do we want to have 1 million followers on Instagram? What's more valuable, right? Yeah. Right? Or in TikTok, or name your social media platform, right? The value system has already shifted digitally anyway. So, NFTs are just a natural extension where that status is now something that you can truly own and certify. NFTs aren't just used in gaming. They're also used for identity, for instance. Like in Metaverse, we use, for instance, soulbound NFTs as a way to determine your identity, and you can't take that away from you. It's your ID. Now on Steam, if Steam bans your account, that's it. Your entire history on Steam is gone, right? Your player history, everything that every status, every badge that you collected is gone. But in Web3, that wouldn't be possible because it belongs to you.
Yeah, no, and I actually read that you considered NFTs to that of the MP3s in the early days. Yeah,
I mean, by the time we reach mass adoption, we won't be talking about NFTs. We'll be just talking about sort of, basically digital items or, some collectible. We might not even sort of phrase it as, oh, you own this game item? Cool. Hey, that's a cool skin. You won't even think about it in the term of an NFT. They just assume that NFT technology is behind it because you can trade it and own it and do other stuff with it.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, actually. And one other thing, one of the other bigger topics is I wanted to understand from you is your vision for the open metaverse? Because it's something that you've spoken about a lot, whether it be on podcasts or in talks, etc. But I wanted to understand how or why the open metaverse has been such a major focus for Animoca and for you as well, and how you see that.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of terms, the problem is that metaverse as a term has been co-opted by Meta.
Yeah.
And the problem, therefore, is that when Facebook doesn't do a good job with the metaverse, everyone thinks, oh, that's the end of the metaverse. We describe the open metaverse, the foundation of that, as the space where we can have digital property rights, meaning that the open metaverse can really only exist on-chain, as in Web3. And why is that? That's because that is the way that the network effects generated from our data that we create value for can generate value for us. Whether we sort of trade it, give it away, have ownership, through these token economies, right? And that means, and why do we call it the open metaverse to distinguish from the regular metaverse is because it's permissionless and interoperable, right? Meaning that you can own it, as opposed to, in Facebook or in Instagram, where you could have a presence, you could have, an account with millions of followers, but guess who really owns it? The platform does. And if Instagram or even X doesn't like you, all it does is press a button and your account is gone and everything you've built up, you have no property. This is akin to essentially central governments basically controlling your property ownership. And the reason, by the way, why sort of the countries that have good property rights have higher GDPs and higher economies is because you have the certainty of the rights of ownership, which we think will happen in Web3. So that's kind of how we define the open metaverse in terms of essentially sort of digital property rights and why NFTs and blockchain is such an important component. So when you add all that component together, then the open metaverse is already an economy that is the size of nations. Right now, it's around a $3+ trillion market. Trading of these items are, including NFTs and tokens, is anywhere from $100 to $200 billion a day, right? So we've kind of already hit a kind of digital nation state, as it were, through essentially what's happening in Web3. The number of people that are effectively making a sustainable living income is in the tens of millions of people in the space, right? So economically, I would argue that that sort of Web3 / the open metaverse is probably the size of a top 50 nation at this point. When you look at DeFi, over $100 billion of TVL, which is basically larger than the foreign fiscal reserves of places like the Bank of Greece or the Bank of New Zealand, right? So these are really strong economic numbers that demonstrate that there's really real activity in the space. And the way we distinguish the open metaverse versus the metaverse is that the metaverse we think is a little bit like Disneyland. You come in as a tourist and you have fun, you put these goggles on, whatever, but you don't have ownership, so it doesn't mean anything to you. Whereas the open metaverse is the one that you truly own something. And just to clarify quickly, a lot of people confuse the metaverse with accessing it with VR. I mean, you could argue that Fortnite and Roblox is already a kind of metaverse, just not one that you own anything. It's not open, right? But VR goggles is really just one better way of potentially entering the space, but it is not the only way, and it's certainly not the most popular way.
Yeah, I think there's that confusion piece when you mentioned that metaverse. To a lot of people, they instantly think I'm putting on a headset and I'm going into a digital world.
That's right.
That's just virtual reality.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And virtual reality can extend both into, I guess, gaming or the open metaverse.
Yeah. No, definitely. Now, we like to do a bit kind of on this show and understand your gaming background.
Okay.
Now, as you mentioned, I assume you grew up a gamer. You worked for obviously Atari.
Yes.
Time ago.
Digging all the way back. But
all the way back. But yes. I'm keen to understand what the first gaming system you remember owning would be.
Oh, well, I mean, my first gaming experience broadly was obviously I was playing on sort of arcade a lot, right? So I think games like Yi Kung Fu, obviously later on Pac-Man, Pong, that was kind of my interest in space. Probably the very first gaming unit was probably the gaming PC. So experience I had was obviously a Texas Instrument. It was a TI-99, which is really just a glorified calculator. 16 kilobytes of RAM. 16 kilobytes, my goodness, right? And the reason it was a Texas Instrument is because I couldn't afford a ZX Spectrum, because that was like the premium at the time. But I'm struggling whether it was that or maybe a Trickotronic. Right, and for those who don't remember, a Trickotronic was basically like a handheld. Actually, it was from Nintendo before they were basically doing the Famicom. And you had just basic controls, and it was really just LED screen, basic screens where you're basically just doing basic commands. And it was, there was a Mickey Mouse one. Donkey Kong had, that was actually the origin of the Donkey Kong game. So it's either that or my TI-99 as my first gaming unit, as it were. And the TI-99, I didn't get it because I wanted to play games on it. It was actually used as an accounting machine to do number crunching for a business that my father was involved in at the time, but nobody in the office knew how to use it, so they just brought it home, and it came with one game that was prepackaged with it. It was called Parsec, and Parsec was basically kind of like a game very similar to what we would know today as kind of like R-Type, maybe, or maybe I'm sort of dating myself as well because R-Type was big on the Commodore and Amiga, but I would say most of my gaming activity afterwards started with the Commodore 64, right? Yeah. So I upgraded from a TI-99 to a C64, and this first with the tape, and then with the floppy disk, and then graduated to an Atari ST. And the Atari ST had MIDI ports, and actually, because I studied music, that's actually how I got into Atari, because I was basically composing music and creating composition software for Atari back in the day. And that's also how I got online, because we were connecting online, and back then with bulletin board systems like FidoNet and Genie, again 80s products, where it was pre-internet, and we were just sharing information and sharing software, and that was my beginnings.
Perfect. And so, what would you say the first game you fell in love with was?
Oh, I mean, so fell in love with. God, every game was fascinating. I mean, the number of hours I spent on Trickotronic games was like crazy. The number of hours I spent on Parsec, because it was the only game I played with, wow, this is fun, right? But I would say, if I had to sort of point a game that really altered my perspective perhaps on gaming and its potential, probably would have been Elite.
Yeah.
So I played Elite on the C64, and it was probably one of the very first sort of open world type of games that are out there. And it was all vector graphics. And for those of you who might not remember, I know there's been a crowdfunded sequel that I, also participated in before. But it was really you're flying around space, going from planet to planet. You're basically trading. You're fighting pirates. Had pretty good AI for something back from the 80s. I think it was a masterpiece of its time. And the number of hours I just sunk into that was just insane. It wasn't multiplayer at all. But I think that kind of opened up the world in terms of, wait a second, this is a whole sort of thing that sucks you in time and space in a manner. Because prior to that, most of the games were not open world. So even Pac-Man, which I played a lot, had a mission and a level, and you could save it off, and then there was a quest that you finished at a moment. So many of the games were basically sort of quest-driven, right?
Yeah.
Whereas that one had no ending, really. You could just go on forever. And I think that was sort of really sort of gives a perspective of, virtual life and virtual reality.
Perfect. And so for you, what would you say your favourite game of the last decade will have been?
Oh, my goodness.
This is always a real tricky one for people.
It's tricky because I have to sort of, last 10 years, like which games did I play? Because there's always a recency effect, right? Where you kind of say, well, these are the games that... So I would say most influential to me, I would have to say is Minecraft.
Yeah.
And obviously the sandbox inspiration is very much sort of a genesis of that. Partially because it was the world-building UGC side. I'm a big fan of UGC content. I'm a big fan of endless worlds, right? And just keep building and having ownership in these things. So I would say Minecraft was probably it. Roblox, I know it was influential and obviously studied and played it, but it didn't have the same impact because with Minecraft, I could build my own server, right? And we used to run our own server. And more importantly, we ran that server for our family as well. And when my kids were younger, they would play on that platform and they would log in. And it was kind of like your own hosted environment set up with your particular rules that you thought made sense and experiment around it. So I would say Minecraft was probably that experience. Obviously, as the kids got older, they started playing games like, obviously Valorant and Apex. So I got into a bit of a sort of big Apex bend just because the kids were playing it. But then it just got so good, and I didn't advance quite as well. And suddenly they were carrying me all the time. And then I kind of became a drag. So I'm like, yeah, maybe that's not for me.
I'll leave you to it then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you saw PUBG Ally, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I need, I need an Apex Ally when that actually comes into play, which has really been my kids in the past. But, maybe that's one way to balance it out a little bit.
Perfect. And I'm going to just finish on one question before we wrap up.
Of course.
What game are you most excited for?
Ooh, okay. Well, how do I put it? I think it's fair to say that everyone is excited for good and bad reasons for GTA 6. I'm excited for GTA 6 because I think it's going to cause a resurgence in our industry. I don't look at it from the perspective of which games I would like to play only. I look at it from the perspective of what does it do to our industry.
Yeah.
So post-COVID, we saw there was a massive interest in games during COVID. But interesting enough, if you look at the stats, after COVID, the gaming industry actually stagnated. There hasn't been growth. And the reason why it's been so difficult for game studios, particularly in Web 2, is because there's been no growth opportunities. And yet, neither Apple nor Facebook nor all these companies have been reducing their rent. When there's a difficult time in the market, in a true market economy, for instance, you're on a restaurant and you have difficult time in business, what happens? You negotiate with your landlord and he says, you know what, I'll give you a discount on your rent, or maybe a moratorium or some rebates so you can do your business. Apple? Basically, screw you, I don't care. 30%, I don't care, right? You're out of business, I don't care, right? That's basically 99%. The landlords of the space are in this area. So what's been missing is that growth vector. Outside of the fact that the platforms are not going to reduce their fees, where do you need to see growth? There's Web3 or there's triggers in the space. And this year we have two major triggers. Switch 2, which interestingly enough, hadn't launched a new, just think about that, right? A unit that sold almost 150 million units before and generated over 1.3 billion sales of games has not released a new console in, I think, 7 or 8 years. So this is Nintendo's big hardware release, the Switch 2. So I think it's going to be massive because it's going to drive new excitement, new volume, and of course GTA 6. Hopefully, knock on wood, it doesn't get delayed again because it's been the constant thing. I think everyone's talking about September this year. I think it's going to be a massive shift. I've enjoyed GTA before, but I would say again it's the open worlds thing. But more importantly, what they're going to be doing with AI, inspiring the space, bringing attention, driving console sales, driving hardware sales, and reigniting, I guess, the imagination and the growth prospects of gaming. I think we've had not very exciting news in the Web 2 gaming field. And by the way, I think this is where Web 3 becomes really interesting as well, because outside of it being sort of the new growth narratives around that, it's also going to drive a lot of interest in, how can we make these games better with Web 3 technology? And I think actually GTA 6, I think, is going to be a macro gaming driver, which will have impacts in both Web 2 and Web 3.
I think I totally agree with you on that one. So, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I wish we had more time to explore because I've got so many more questions here that we didn't have time for. But thank you very much for tuning in today. Hope you really enjoyed that one. And we'll see you again very soon.